Welcome back to our next lesson in music theory. We've spent some time talking about notes and intervals, and so we're going to take some of that information that we've picked up and learn about triads and seventh chords. So as I was saying, we're going to begin working with chords, which are the basic vocabulary of tonal harmony. We will not be concerned at this stage with how chords are used compositionally, or even what kinds of chords occur in major and minor modes, although we will encounter these topics soon enough. First, we have to learn how to spell the more common chord types and how to recognize them in various contexts. The fundamental tertian, or chord based off of three notes, is a triad. A three-note chord consisting of a fifth divided into two superimposed thirds. Or in other words, if we start with our first note, there's a third up to the third note of our scale if we're starting on the tonic, and then another third up, which would take us to the fifth. So between 1 and 5, and then 1 dividing those in the middle. There are 4 possible ways to combine major and minor thirds to produce a tertian triad. So we can see here 4 different types of tertian triads. The first one here on the left, this is an augmented triad. We can tell that 2 ways. Either we can see that augmented fifth on between the first and the fifth, or we can see the fact that it's built with 2 major thirds. Those 2 major thirds mean that that fifth will be augmented, but there's 2 major thirds. Then we have our major and minor triads. Both of them have a perfect fifth between the 2 outside notes. Our major triad has a major third on the bottom and a minor third on the top, while our minor triad has a minor third on the bottom and a major third on the top. The other type of triad that we have here is a diminished triad. This is built with 2 minor third intervals. So we can see here their names and how they look when they're stacked on top of each other. Our augmented interval, which is notated using a plus symbol. Our major interval, or major triad, which uses a capital M. Our minor triad, which uses a lowercase m. And our diminished triad, which in classical music uses a sort of degree symbol, a superscript O, or if you're in a more sort of pop or jazz realm, they'll often use a minus symbol as opposed to that plus symbol with the augmented. You might be able to guess from listening to them that in tonal music, the major and minor triads are found the most often, and the augmented the least often. There are also names in addition to the note names for the members of a triad. So the bottom note is our root, the middle note is our third, and the top note is our fifth. Third because it's a third above the root, and the fifth because it's a fifth above the root. We really want to make sure that we study this diagram and examples very carefully before we go on. So at this point, you can go ahead and start on checkpoint 1 and then make your way to self-test 3-1. So there we go. Lots of examples of triads, and we should have a really good understanding of what makes up different types of triads. So as we extend our chords to include more notes, the next type of chord that we encounter is a seventh chord. If we extend a tertian triad by adding another third on top of the fifth of the triad, the result is a 4-note chord, and because the interval between this added note and the root is some kind of seventh, either a major, a minor, or a diminished seventh, chords of this sort are called seventh chords. Because it would be possible to use more than one kind of seventh with each triad type, there are many more seventh chord types than triad types. However, tonal harmony commonly makes use of only 5 seventh chord types. So here we can see that below each chord, you will find the commonly used name for each chord and the symbol used as an abbreviation. So here we can see 5 different seventh chords. We have 2 chords that are based on a major triad. We've got 1 chord that's based off of a minor triad and 2 chords that are based off of a diminished triad. The first chord we see is our major seventh, or sometimes we refer to this as a major seventh, and it's notated with a capital M and a 7. With our major seventh, we have a major triad in the bottom, and then we add a major seventh on top of that. One way to figure out a major seventh is to go to your root and move down a semitone. So in this case, A is our root, our seventh is G sharp. Our next seventh chord, in classical music, we often refer to it as a major minor seventh, but in pop music and jazz, it's often referred to as a dominant seventh. It is built by taking a major triad in the bottom, just like our previous chord, but instead of using that major seventh, we utilize the minor seventh. So that's going down a full tone from our tonic. So here we can see that A is our tonic and a G natural as our seventh. Then we've got our minor seventh, or our minor seventh, being that you have a minor triad with a minor seventh above it. It is notated with a lowercase m7. Our 2 diminished chord types are a half diminished seventh and a fully diminished seventh. With our half diminished seventh, we take that diminished triad that we saw earlier and add a minor seventh. Because it has a minor seventh, it's only half diminished. Finally, we see a diminished seventh. So this chord is our diminished triad with a diminished seventh above it. And like they said, there are many other chord types as well. Quite soon, we will begin composition exercises using triads. Although seventh chords will not be used in composition exercises for some time, you will nevertheless begin to become familiar with them from an analytical standpoint through examples and analysis assignments. So, at this point, can you please start on checkpoint 2 and then work on assignment 3-2? Great. So the next topic to cover when it comes to triads and seventh chords are inversions of chords. So what we've seen is root position, where we have our first note, a third above that, then a third above that, then a third above that. What happens when those groups of chords don't look that way? They're spaces. Luckily, usually, even though they're spaces, they make up one chord. But what has happened is instead of having that root on the bottom, now the third is on the bottom and the root has been moved somewhere else. So up to now, we've been notating all chords with the root as the lowest tone. However, in a musical context, any part of a chord might appear as the lowest tone. The 3 possible bass positions of the triad are illustrated here. So we can see the first one is in root position, as we would call it. In the second one, that root has been moved above them, so that lower F to the higher F, that is what we refer to as first inversion, and the other one, the third, has been moved as well. The bass position that we've been using with the root as the lowest tone, or in the bass, is called the root position. You might assume that third position would be in the term for a chord with the third as the lowest note, but musical terminology is fraught with inconsistencies. Instead, this position is called first inversion. Reasonably enough, second inversion is used for chords with the fifth in the bass. The term inversion is used here to mean the transfer of the lowest note to some higher octave. So here's an example of those same chords, but now with their name underneath them. These next chords are first inversion F major triads. Notice that the upper notes of the chord can be spaced in any way without altering the bass position. Also, any of the notes can be duplicated or doubled in different octaves. So we can see that in all these examples, A is the lowest pitch. So in the first one, the A is in the treble clef. The second one, the A is on the top line in the bass clef. The third one, the A is in the bottom space of the bass clef, and then we're back to that top line. The rest of the notes are different in every single one of them, and of course will sound different, like this. The inversion of seventh chords works just like the inversion of triads, except that 3 inversions, or 4 bass positions, are possible. So here we can see that it's important to understand that the inversions of a triad or seventh chord is determined only by what member of the chord is in the bass. Any chord members may appear in the soprano or in the other voices without changing the inversion. So here we see that root position, first inversion, second inversion, and in seventh chords, a third inversion. Now we're going to move on to inversion symbols and figured bass. So in analyzing music, we often use numbers to indicate the bass position of the chords. Instead of using 1 for first inversion, 2 for second inversion, and so on, we use numbers derived from the Baroque system called figured bass or thorough bass. During the Baroque period, which was approximately from 1600 to 1750, the keyboard player in an ensemble read from a part consisting only of a bass line and some symbols indicating the chord to be played. In the Baroque system, the symbols consisted basically of numbers representing intervals above the bass to be formed by the members of the chord. But the notes could actually be played in any octave above the bass. The system dealt only with intervals, not with roots or chords, because the theory of chord roots had not been devised when figured bass was first developed. This table illustrates the figured bass symbols for root position and inverted triads and seventh chords for a G major triad and a G major minor seventh. So in our first chord, we can see the complete figured bass symbol. We would call this a 3-5 because there's a third above the root and a fifth above the root. Sorry, not root, but bass note. It does not get any special symbol because it's in root position, and the 1 is the bass note. The root is the bass note. When we invert our triad for first inversion, there's still a third above the bass note, but now instead of having a fifth above the bass note, there's a sixth. That sixth above the bass note is the actual root of the chord. Because it still has a 3, we don't notate the 3, but we call this a C major, and then we would notate a 6 for the inversion. Our second inversion of a triad does not have a third above the bass note, but it has a fourth and a sixth. We refer to this and use a symbol of a 6/4. When we move to seventh notes, a root position seventh chord gets a 7 on the end to show that there is a seventh added on. We have the same intervals in first inversion with that 5/3, but there's that added sixth. So we refer to this as a 6/5 because the 3 remains constant. Our second inversion in a seventh chord has a third, a fourth, and a sixth. So in this case, we call this a 4/3 chord. And finally, our third inversion we call a 4/2 because its unique intervals are that fourth and that second. Don't worry too much, you'll get some practice. In the figured bass system, the number 6 designates a sixth above the bass, whether it's a major sixth or a minor sixth, depending on the key signature. If the Baroque composer wished to direct a keyboard player to raise or lower a note, there were several methods that could be used, including the following 3. An accidental next to an Arabic numeral in the figured bass could be used to raise or lower a note. So here we see a D with a sharp 4/3. So first of all, we would know that because it's a 4/3, it's a seventh chord, so there has to be 4 tones. The third is above the root. Then there will be a sharpened fourth above the root, which we see with that G sharp, and then finally the sixth above that. An accidental by itself always referred to the third above the bass and could be used to alter that note. So here we've got an E, and underneath it is just a sharp. So that's telling me that the third is sharp. A slash or plus sign in connection with an Arabic numeral is meant to raise the note. So here we see a augmented fourth, so we want to make sure that when we're putting that fourth in, it gets raised. In this example, a portion of an actual figured bass part from the Baroque period is here, along with a possible realization that would have been improvised by the keyboardist. Some keyboard players may have added embellishments not shown in this realization. Bach included the numeral 5 at several places to remind the player to play a root position triad. The realization of figured bass is still considered to be an effective way of learning certain aspects of tonal composition, and we will occasionally use exercises of this kind in these lessons. The inversion symbols that we use today are summarized in this table. These symbols are usually used with a Roman numeral, such as I for 1 and V for 5, as part of a harmonic analysis. Roman numeral analysis is explained in an upcoming chapter. Notice that when a seventh chord is inverted, the seventh is replaced by the appropriate inversion symbol. Lead sheet symbols or pop symbols. So there are some intriguing parallels and contrasts between the figured bass system of the 17th and 18th centuries and the lead sheet cymbals, sometimes called pop cymbals, developed for use with jazz and other types of popular music in the 20th and 21st centuries. Both facilitated the notation process and served to provide sufficient information to allow the performer to improvise with certain bounds. However, whereas the figured bass system provided the bass line with symbols indicating the chords that were to be constructed above it, lead sheet cymbals appear along with a melody and indicate the chords that are to be constructed below it. There are various lead sheet cymbal systems in use, just as there were frequently minor differences between the approaches taken by different composers to use the figured bass symbols. Nevertheless, the system here is quite widely used today and would be understood by any competent jazz or pop musician. The 4 triad types and the 5 common 7th chord types with their associated pop symbols are here. Under each chord, you will find the symbol that we have already seen for them, and under each of these is the lead sheet symbol. With the exception of the half diminished seventh, there is a clear correlation between the two systems. So, where we had a major chord, we would just call that an E chord, where we have, because it's based on E. Where in the classical they would put just a small m for minor, we put E minor to indicate E. Diminished, we have E dim, and augmented E plus. We go for an E major seventh for our major seventh chord. We have just a seventh chord for our major minor seventh chord, a minor seventh chord for our minor seventh chord. This one is a bit different with the half diminished. We realize it as a minor chord with an altered fifth, so a flat 5. And then the diminished seventh is similar to the diminished triad. This list of symbols is incomplete because there are some chords that we will introduce later. A special case is the chord with an added sixth, as in C6, which calls on a triad with an added note, a major sixth above the root. Also, lead sheet symbols will occasionally specify a particular bass note, as in C/G, which calls for a C major triad over a G note in the bass, a triad in second inversion. Finally, you may discover that lead sheet symbols frequently differ from one edition to the next because editors and arrangers routinely make substitutions, simplifying or complicating the harmony as they see fit. In this example, which is from the beginning of a typical American standard ballad, and it uses 5 of the chord types seen in the previous example. Notice that the flat in the F sharp minor flat 5 does not literally mean to flat the fifth, but to lower it from C sharp to C natural. This is a very common jazz standard called Autumn Leaves. Please take the time to complete your assignment 3.3. Next, we're moving on to recognizing chords in various textures. Some students, especially those without much keyboard experience, find it difficult at first to analyze a chord that is distributed over 2 or more staves. as in these examples here. One procedure to follow with the chord is to make an inventory of all the pitch classes found in the chord. So pitch classes are individual pitches that are there. So in this chord, we have a B flat, a G, and a D. And to notate the chord with each pitch class in turn as the lowest from the lowest note. The other note should be put as close to the bottom note as possible. The version that consists only of stacked thirds is in root position. We can see from this example that the chord in the previous example is a G minor triad in first inversion. This next chord contains the pitch classes E, A, C sharp, and G, allowing 4 bass positions. In this example, we're told that the chord from the previous example is an A major minor 7th chord in second inversion. You might be ready to be able to carry out this process in your head, which will speed things up considerably. If not, you will only learn to do so with more practice. At this time, please complete checkpoint 3 and then move on to assignment 3-4. The fundamental sonority of tonal harmony is the triad, a 3-note chord consisting of a 7th divided into 2 superimposed thirds. The bottom note of the 5th is the root, and the top note is the 5th. The note that divides the 5th is the 3rd. There are 4 triad types: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. A 7th chord may be thought of as a triad with another third above the 5th of the chord. The added note is a 7th above the root. Although many 7th chord types are possible, only 5 occur with any frequency in tonal harmony. The major 7th chord, or capital M7, is a major triad with a major 7th above the root. The major minor 7th chord, notated as capital M lowercase m7 or just 7, is a major triad with a minor 7th above the root. The minor 7th chord is a minor triad with a minor 7th above the root. The half diminished 7th chord is a diminished triad with a minor 7th above that root. And finally, the diminished 7th chord is a diminished triad with a diminished 7th above the root. Root position is the term for a chord with the root notated as the lowest note. Any other arrangement is called an inversion. A chord with the 3rd as the lowest note is in first inversion, whereas one with the 5th as the lowest note is in second inversion. A 7th chord with the 7th as the lowest note is in third inversion. There are symbols for most of the various bass positions, as we see here. Inversion symbols are derived from figured bass, a method of abbreviated notation used in the Baroque era. Lead sheet symbols are used in jazz and most popular music to indicate chords to be played under a given melody. Both figured bass symbols and lead shape or pop symbols will be used occasionally throughout much of our lessons.